Shavua Tov. Today's daf is Tzadi Hey, and the Gemara is in the middle of a story about an angry relationship between a Jewish butcher and a Jew. He's like an adversary. This Gemara and the story reminds us of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, baseless hatred. Because what happens is the butcher kind of needles his adversary. He says to him, "You know what? I fattened up this ox and the meat is excellent, tip top. And if we only had a relationship, I would give you some of that meat. But instead, I'm gonna cut you out. You're not gonna have any of this glorious meat, this wonderful steak." And the butcher went ahead and he sold the meat to a guy, to an idolater. So to the surprise of the butcher, his adversary tells him, "Hey, you know what? I ate from that wonderful meat because I bought it from the guy and I ate it." At that point, the butcher says to him, "Hey, buddy, you should know I slaughtered two oxen and one was treif, and that's the one I gave to the guy. So if you ate the meat from the guy, then you ate treifa meat." So that was the story that the Gemara tells. And the case came in front of Rebbe. What's the issue that Rebbe has to address? Once there's an admission, a disclosure, so to speak, a statement on the part of the butcher that the meat that he sold to a guy is treif, then you can't buy any meat from that guy because any meat from that guy might be the treifa meat. But yet, Rebbe said the following. So let's just take a look at where we're holding now. We're on Tzadi Hey Amid Aleph, and we're up to Amar Rebbe. So that's line 5. Rebbe says, "B'shvil shota zeh she'asa shelo kahogen, anu nesar kol hamakulin." So Rebbe says that this uh, butcher who made the disclosure that he had sold treifa meat to the guy is a shota. And why is he a shota? Because he's not allowed to sell treifa meat to a middleman who's a guy, because he knows that that guy in that city, which is made up of Jewish people, is going to sell that meat to a Jew. And if he sells the meat to a Jew, the Jew is going to assume that it's kosher meat because all the butchers locally are kosher, are Jewish butchers. So if we rely on this admission of the butcher that the meat that he shechted turned out to be treif and he sold it to a guy, we're going to have to prohibit all the meat in the market, because amongst that meat there's non-kosher meat. So the Gemara says that it seems that Rebbe is worried about meat in the market that's sold by goyim only in a case where we know that the meat had somewhere in it, amongst it, it had treifa. And that's Rebbe Litameh, the Gemara says, the Omar, Makulin v'tavche Yisrael. If you have a city where there's a marketplace that's the vendors who are selling meat in that meat marketplace are non-Jews, they're idolaters, but they are purchasing their meat from the local butchers who are Jewish, then the halacha splits. basar hanimtza biyad ovi kochavim mutter. If we find that the meat is in the hands of the guy, then you're allowed to buy that meat and eat that meat because you assume it came from a kosher butcher. And we'll see later on what Rebbe's going to say if the meat was already cooked, because then we don't know who cooked it, or maybe a guy cooked it, but we'll get to that in a minute. And we see here that a Rebbe is lishitaso, meaning Rebbe is consistent in his opinion that, as a general rule, we don't assume there's non-kosher meat in the market because all the meat is coming from Jewish butchers. And even though in this case you might have said, well, here's a disclosure on the part of the Jewish butcher that he sold to the guy non-Jewish meat, he says that's not enough to prohibit all the meat in the market. Ika Diamri, or another transmission of what exactly Rebbe said. Omar Rebbe Neshota Zedi Chavin Letzuri Lechavrion and Esakol Makulin. We don't even believe this butcher when he says that he shechted the meat and it turned out to be a treifa and he sold to. We don't believe it. We think he made up the whole story. Why? Because the only reason he told the story was in order to needle his adversary and tell him that, oh, buddy, you bought non-treifa meat and you ate it from the guy, but the whole story was just one big bluff. Now, from the fact that Rebbe says that we can eat from this marketplace where the vendors are idolaters because we don't even believe that the butcher who claims that he sold this vendor treifa is not believed to say that. We think he's just lying through his teeth in order to anger this adversary. So the whole thing is just a made up story. But if, let's say, we do have a confession, a disclosure on the part of one of the butchers, and we have every reason to believe that the butcher is telling the truth, that he sold treifa, which he shouldn't have done, but he sold treifa to the guy. So the Gemara says, you would not be allowed to purchase meat from a marketplace if you know that there's one treifa in the entire marketplace. Because when you're buying from the vendor who's an idolater, you have to be choshesh, you have to be concerned with the possibility that maybe what he's selling you is that piece of treifa meat. That's if we have an honest, reliable disclosure that there was treifa meat sold to the idolater. So the Gemara asks the following, I don't get it. We have a principle called rov. Vasanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rebbe Omer, Makuli v'tabche Yisrael, Basar nimtza b'yadovi kochav mutter. Since the butchers in that locale are Jewish butchers, then we could buy the meat from the Goyish vendors, and we have every reason to assume that it's kosher meat. So how do we reconcile that with the fact that Rebbe in the story of the adversary, by implication, is conveying to us that if we know that, based on this disclosure, if it's a reliable one, that the Jewish butcher sold treifa meat to the goyish vendor, then we have to aser buying any of the meat. Why? We're going to rely on the fact that the huge preponderant majority of the meat that's being sold is kosher meat. So we're answering Shani Hocha this Chazik Yisur. You're right. As a general rule, the Brisa transmits that Rebbe holds you can buy meat from the non-Jewish butcher, from the non-Jewish idolaters who are vendors who are selling meat in the market, because all the butchers in town are Jewish. But if you know for a fact that this vendor here in the marketplace is selling treifa meat because we have a reliable disclosure to that effect, then that's called the Chazik Yisur. You don't play around with rovs when you know that there's Isur there. So rov is only reliable when you have no reason to think otherwise, and you can rely on Rov. But if you have reason to think otherwise, you know that there is non-kosher meat here. That's called ischazik yisur. Okay, now we begin the main sugya for today's daf, and that's Amar Rav. Basar kevin shenisalim in alayin asur. Rav says that unless the meat was under supervision from the get-go, 100% from the beginning to the end, then we have to be afraid that maybe although there was kosher meat here, maybe this meat was switched. And the case that the chash of concern of Rav was that maybe a raven came, and although the meat in this city is kosher, the raven took this meat, and either he, she, or a buddy of his came, another raven, and dropped non-kosher meat that came from a different city, which is made up of goyim. Meisvei, what is Rav going to do with the following brisa of Rebbe? Rebbe Omer Makula V'Tavche Yisrael, that if you have a local market, which all the meat that's supplied in this market come from the local butchers that are all Jewish butchers, then you can buy the meat from the vendor who's an idolater. Clearly, no one supervised this meat. You're going to walk in and here's a meat store, that's being run by Joe, idol worshiper, and who's supervising the meat? Maybe the raven came and took it away. And the Gemara answers, Nimtza biyad oved kol chavim shiny. When did Rav say that we have to be afraid that the raven came and switched the meat? That's only when the meat is out there in Noah's land. But if the meat is being sold by the vendor, even though the vendor is an idolater, he doesn't want the ravens to come and take his meat. He certainly is going to supervise and guarantee that the meat was not taken away. And therefore, even Rav would agree that's not called basar shenesalim minayin, and it's mutter toshma. We're going to ask a kasha Rav from a different brisa. Now, this brisa that we're about to learn is a very, very famous brisa. It's like if you're studying your Yeridea for Smicha, this is like the Aleph base. Teisha Chanuyos, you have a city that has 10 butcheries, stores that sell meat. 9 out of the 10 mochros basar shchuta. The achas, but there's one store that sells treifa meat, nevela. Lokach miachas meveni yedei mehen. Lokach. Now, if he's buying meat for his dog, then the Jew is going to pay less for treifa meat, nevela. So therefore, he would go into that store which sells nevela. If he's buying meat for his house, he's going to go into one of the 9 kosher butcher shops. But he doesn't remember. Did he go in to buy meat for his dog, or what was it called, Gainsburg, whatever it's called, or did he go in to buy meat for his house, for his family? He doesn't remember. It's fake asa. Then in such a case, it's as if 50% of the butchers are selling non-kosher meat, because from the perspective of the mindset of this Jew who went into a store and doesn't remember, there's really 50-50. I mean, it doesn't matter that there's only 1 out of 10, but that's the one that's selling cheap meat, that's nevela. And if he was buying it for his dog, that's where he went in. But benimtza, let's say in a different case where the meat was found outside in the street, and there's no way of determining whether or not it was kosher meat from the 9 kosher butcher stores, or it came from that one single non-kosher butchery that's selling treifa, nevela, then aslina basaruba. We have a principle called kol de parish, meruba parish. Whatever comes out, we assume it came out of the rov. And since 9 out of 10 butcheries are selling kosher meat, he has the right to assume that it came from the kosher meat store, and he can feed it to his family. In any event, there's a problem here, because what are you telling me? You found meat in the street. There are 9 kosher butcher shops, but who supervised the meat? How do you know that this is the same meat that came out of one of the 9 butcher stores? Maybe the raven came, took the meat, and switched it with meat from another city, which is treifa meat. What is Rav going to do with this brisa? I think our answer is Hachanami. Again, we're going to use the same answer. B'dimtza biyad ovik hachavim. It wasn't that he found the meat unsupervised, just laying in the middle of the street, but rather he found the meat in the hands of the guy. He doesn't have any clue whether the guy bought it from the kosher butcher shops or from that one single non-kosher butcher shops. And here Rav says that it's considered supervised meat, meaning it never left the possession of the guy who went into the store and purchased it. He would not let a raven come and switch it. And therefore, you can assume that the guy went into the rove of the butcher shops, and that is 9 out of 10 that are selling kosher meat. Toshma, another kash on Rav from a Mishnah. Where is this Mishnah? It's in Machshirin. Matzah basar. Right, you have a city that's, let's say, half Jewish and half non-Jewish, and he finds meat. And the halacha is, im chai, if it hasn't been cooked, I'll explain why that's important. Halach acharov tabachin. Where are most of, not where, but who are most of the butchers? If most of the butchers are Jewish, then as long as the meat is raw, you're allowed to assume that it came from the majority of the butchers who are Jewish and shecht kosher meat, as long as it's raw. But im mevushal, then you have another problem, because there's a sugya at the end of Masechta Avodah Zarah about what's called bishul akum. And a classic case of bishul akum would be meat, raw meat that was cooked by a guy. So mishum chasnus, in order to make sure we don't marry into this, they made a gzera that we don't eat meat that was cooked by a guy. Here we have machlokas between the Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, whether it's enough if the Jew turns on the fire, or the Jew has to actually put the meat on top of the fire, whatever it is. But that's called bishul akum. So therefore, halach acharov ochli basar. For example, there might be a city where most of the butchers in the city are indeed Jewish, and it could be that even the majority of the population of the city is Jewish, but the meat eaters in that city are goyim. In other words, the volume of meat that's eaten by that city, the greater majority of that volume is eaten by non-Jews. And if that be the case, the non-Jew is the one for his own table who cooked the meat, and therefore it's bishul akum. By the way, you see this from this Gemara, that bishul akum doesn't mean that I know the guy intimately who's cooking the meat. It doesn't matter. Any guy on the face of the earth who cooks the meat that was raw, I'm not allowed to eat the meat, even though it's kosher meat. Now, here the Gemara says we can't give the old answer to defend Rav, that even though this meat is unsupervised, but maybe it was in the hands of the guy, you'll give you the same answer with him to be out and therefore the meat was always supervised, and the idolater would not allow the raven to come and switch the meat. Is basar? Why is it that the Mishnah and Machshira differentiates between whether or not it's cooked or it's raw? Forget about that. Let's see who's holding on to the meat. Next thing, if it's being held on by a guy, that means the guy was the one who cooked it. If on the other hand the Jew is holding on to the meat, and presumably he cooked it for his family, so therefore it's not bishul akum. Why doesn't the Mishnah say that, you know what, you want to know whether this meat was cooked by a guy or a Jew? It depends who's holding on to the meat. That would certainly indicate proof positive whether it was cooked by a guy or cooked by a Jew. Ella, what? You see that since the Mishnah doesn't use that determining factor, who's holding on to it, then the Mishnah is totally oblivious to where the meat is. As long as we find it in the street, we'll figure out who are the most ochlim, and we'll go by the majority. And if the majority of the ochlim in that city are Jewish, then we'll assume that the bishul was done by a Jew for his family, and we can eat the meat. And we're not choshesh that maybe a raven came down from the heavens and switched the meat with meat that came from another city where the butchers are non-Jews. So we see clearly, says the Gemara in its analytical study here, that we're not talking about a case where we found it in the hands of the guy. If we found it in the hands of the guy, that's upgrade. That for sure is bishalakim. There's a Jew standing, and he sees the meat that falls from someone. He can't identify that person. He doesn't know who he is. But there was never a moment in time when the meat was lacking supervision because the Jews saw that it came out of the hands of somebody. Whoever that somebody was, he's unidentified, but he certainly was supervising the meat, not allowing it to be taken by a raven. And he saw the meat coming down. No raven came along to switch the meat. And therefore, you want to know whether or not that person, unidentified, faceless person, who dropped the meat was a guy or a Jew, whether it's also din bishalakim or not, then it depends on Rov Ochlin, who are the most of the people who consume meat in that city. Toshma. Here we have another kasha on Rav about Basa Shlom Nis'alim and Ayin from a Mishnah in Shkolim. Now, again, just because the Gemara quotes only the end of the Mishnah, we'll just mention in passing what the subject of the Mishnah is. The Mishnah is talking about Basar Kodshim, and the question is whether or not, if you, let's say you find the meat in the Azara, and you don't know whether it was a carbon ola, and therefore no one's allowed to eat it. It's kulikol, even the Kohen can't eat it, or maybe it's chatas, and therefore the Kohen can eat the meat. And the Mishnah goes on there. Again, it's not so relevant to us to say that it depends whether or not the meat that you find was cut into slices, strips of meat, or it was just limbs. It was cut into limbs. Now, when you cut something into limbs, it doesn't require that much work. It's pretty easy. And if we're dealing with a carbon ola, which is kula kalil, then there's no need and no purpose. I mean, the whole thing goes on the fire on the Mizbeach in any event. There's no need to start slicing it up into slices. And therefore, we assume it's a carbon. But if you found slices, then we assume it's a carbon chat. So again, all this is just for edification. Nimtza v'gvulim. This is the part of the Mishnah that's relevant to us. You found meat not in the Azara, in the in the chamber of the Beis Hamikdash, but you found meat out there in the in the marketplace in the city. And now we're going to try to figure out whether or not this was treifa meat. How do we figure that out? It depends what you found. If you found a varim, means that the owner of the meat didn't even take the effort and the time to slice it into slices, then avelis, we have to assume it's the vela. That's because you found it in limbs. But chatichos, if you found it cut up into slices, then you assume that it's kosher meat. But the problem is, nobody is supervising this meat. How do you know that it wasn't switched by the raven? And you'll tell me again, let's use the old logic, the old teretz to defend Rav by saying, the Jew is standing from afar, and he watches the meat falling from somebody who's carrying it, and therefore there was never a moment in which it was unsupervised, is then a varim nevelo samai. If the Jew realizes that this package was dropped inadvertently, then even if he finds it in limbs, that doesn't prove a thing. You can't prove from the fact that it was in limbs that it must be an avela, and therefore he didn't take the bother with the effort and the time to cut it up into slices because it's an avela anyway. It's going to the garbage bin. The answer is no. The Jew saw the meat fall. If he saw the meat fall, then there's no reason in the world that you should assume it's nevela. You're not talking about something that was thrown into the street. You find limbs that were thrown into the street, you assume that it's nevela. That's why he threw it in, and he never slice it into slices. It's not worth the effort. But if you see that it dropped from somebody, then that somebody might have had limbs now, and then he's going to later on slice it into slices. But you have no proof that it's nevela. So again, it can't be a case of omed v'ro'ehu, because if it's omed v'ro'ehu, which would resolve or circumvent the problem against Rav of Bosach and Solomon Ayin, then why do you assume it's the Vela? If it was Omed Veroeu. So the Gemara says the following. You know what? Rav himself answered this question. Why? Midu time Rav, right? You're trying to argue against Rav. Let's see how Rav interpreted that Mishnah. Ha'itmar alei. Rav said, Mutaros, when the Mishnah ruled that you're allowed to eat the meat. No, no, no. That's not what the Mishnah meant. Mishnah never said you're allowed to eat the meat. Let's reinterpret the Mishnah, says Rav. You're not allowed to eat the meat because it's Bosach and Solomon Ayin. And you don't know if it was switched. But rather Mutaros Mishum Nevela. As far as Tum is concerned, we have a right to assume that this is not nevela, that it was shechted, and the shechita is mitayr midei nevela. But as far as achil is concerned, enochinami, you're not allowed to eat it because it's bosich to salmon. Levi says, and he disagrees with Rav on the entire principle of bosich and salmon, mutaros b'achila, that you're allowed to eat it. And we're not going to be choshesh for some wild possibility that a raven came from there and he took it and he burned it and he switched it with another piece. Now, at this point, the Gemara sort of, in a certain sense, backtracks a little bit, because from this controversy between Rav and Levi regarding the Mishnah and Machshir, we certainly see that Rav holds that Bosach and Solomon Ayin is also, and the whole heter of that Mishnah was only as far as Tumah V'Tara is concerned. But now the Gemara sort of backtracks, going back to basics, and says, well, are you sure that Rav actually prohibited Bosach and Solomon Ayin? Wait a second. Rav never made this statement. We know a story and a ruling about Rav, and from that story we deduce that Rav holds that Bosach and Solomon Ayin is also. It was only an inference. The Rav Haviyosef Amabro de Ishtatis. Okay, there's a river called the Ishtatis River, and Rav was sitting on the side. There was a ferry that was crossing this river, and he's watching Rav, what's going on? Chazilahu Gavra, he sees a person who, again, it's a very weird case, but he throws the head of a slaughtered animal into the river.